Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear students and faculty members, dear guests and friends of the American University Kiev. Welcome to yet another exceptional iteration of the AUK Talks, which since April of 2022 have become the flagship online and offline event of our university, where we have hosted dozens of the top world leaders, ambassadors, diplomats, generals, prime ministers, and presidents. Tonight, it's my distinct privilege and honor to welcome for the second time since last December, a good friend, a great friend of Ukraine, and a great supporter of Ukraine, NATO, and of democracy worldwide, and a good personal friend, I'd like to add, Mr. Ian Brzezinski. Ian spoke to our students last winter, and now he's joining us again from Washington, D.C. To discuss, really critical issues related to the level of support within the U.S., the ability of the U.S. to actually support Ukraine, but also other critical allies across the world, such as Israel, potentially Taiwan, and others. And so Ian is going to give us really the kind of the inside view from what we call the capital beltway, based on his not only his extensive experience, but the most recent meetings, conferences, and other events that he has participated in DC. Before we start, I'll make a brief introduction. That Ian is now the resident senior fellow with the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, and he's also a member of the Atlantic Council's Strategy Advisors Group. He has more than 2 decades of experience in U.S. national security. He served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Europe and NATO between 2001 and 2005, and the highlight of his tenure was the big expansion of NATO eastward in 2004, and also the consolidation and reconfiguration of the alliance's command structure, the standing up of the NATO response force, all very important developments that he was personally overseeing. Previously, Ian has served on the Hill as legislative assistant, as an advisor, a senior professional staff member, and because the majority of our guests and audience tonight are from Ukraine, Ian has been related, also linked to Ukraine for almost 30 years, because back in 93, 94, he served as a volunteer in Ukraine, advising the Ukrainian National Security Council, the Foreign Ministry, the Defense Ministry, and the Parliament. So as you can see, ladies and gentlemen, Ian has had a tremendous and exceptional career in the field of global security. So tonight it'll be a wonderful event. You'll have an opportunity to ask him many questions. He has told me that he won't speak more than 10 minutes. He's expecting many questions from you, from the audience, from our students. So Ian, with this, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your support for Ukraine. Welcome, and you have the floor.
Professor Voyager, Mark, thank you for bringing me back to your university, to your class. And I'm really hoping that I'll do well enough that you'll actually invite me to be in Kiev in person.
Absolutely.
You might have noted I lived in Kiev in 93 and 94, and was some of the best years of my life. And I have to say that every day I wake up thinking about Ukraine and hoping that this war will end on Ukraine's terms. Let me start by sharing with you what I think is at stake in this brutal invasion by Russia, this unprovoked, unjust invasion. And I think most of you will know and agree with what I say, so I fear I'll be a little bit redundant to you. But I want you to know where I stand on this conflict before I kind of place it in the context of American internationalism. So there are 5 factors that I think are at stake in this war. And one, of course, is immediate and very personal to our colleagues in this gathering, and that's Ukraine's survival. And of course, it's not just a matter of territory, but Putin is trying to literally redefine the history and identity of the Ukrainian people. And we just saw this this objective being reiterated again earlier this week in just a radical speech by Putin. This is horrible. This is something we haven't seen since World War II. It is genocidal. It is terrifying. So Ukraine's survival, of course, is the most immediate factor in this conflict, and it should be a moral, countering it, defeating it should be a moral imperative of the West. Second, to use overused and sometimes a term that's a phrase that's dismissed by many, the rules-based international order is at stake. That rules-based international order established following the World War II has been the basis for the spread and a sustainment of peace and prosperity, not just in Europe, but globally. And if Putin walks away with 1 inch of Ukrainian territory, we're going to slip back into a world of spheres of influence where might is right, where aggression, resolves disputes. Revanchism will be unleashed. That is a dangerous future for our world, for Europe, for the entire globe. Third, often not discussed, but the role of nuclear weapons and nuclear coercion in international affairs is profoundly being shaped by this conflict. As you well know, one of the key elements of Putin's strategy in his invasion of Ukraine was to threaten nuclear war against countries that would intervene to assist Ukraine. And unfortunately, I feel he's had some success to date. And we hear it from allied leaders, including the United States, statements like no boots on the ground. We can't afford to risk World War III. We've seen it impede both the pace and the quality of the military assistance we have provided Ukraine. This is a dangerous precedent. When we reward nuclear coercion, we're inviting it to happen again. And I would argue we increase the risks of nuclear war. And certainly this conflict and the exercise of nuclear coercion is being watched very carefully by our adversaries around the world. Think of what what Xi in China is thinking about regarding his plans for Taiwan. It can only incentivize countries like Iran to pursue nuclear weapons. It's even creating a debate already in Korea, South Korea, over whether or not they should have nuclear weapons to deter Chinese and North Korean aggression. Fourth, NATO's credibility at stake. I've never bought the argument that since Ukraine is not a NATO member, this war doesn't affect the credibility of the alliance and the confidence our allies have in the alliance. Ukraine is not only on the border of NATO, Ukraine is a European democracy. Ukraine has acted as a de facto NATO ally, sending its forces to Kosovo, to US-led operations in the Middle East and beyond. Its aspirations for NATO membership have been formally embraced, at least formally embraced by the alliance. To assume that NATO isn't affected by this conflict is really short-sighted and naive. What NATO does and what it doesn't do to support Ukraine will shape the confidence the allies have in this institution and the perceptions of our adversaries of NATO. And then finally, to steal a theme from my own father, who was a Sovietologist, Russia's evolution is at stake. My dad said that, Russia will never be a democracy as long as it's an empire. And it will never not be an empire if it continues to suborn or attempt to suborn parts or all of Ukraine. And so I would argue defeating Russia decisively probably provides the best means forward to facilitate, to encourage, to catalyze Russia's transformation into a democracy, into a more constructive international actor, if not a partner. A Russian victory, even a partial victory, so to speak, walking away with part of Ukraine, is going to fundamentally block Russia's ability to transform into a democracy. It will sustain its revanchist ambitions. So those 5 things are what at stake and which should motivate the United States, should motivate the transatlantic community to more decisively support Ukraine. Now, I know that there's growing concerns about U.S. strategy regarding Ukraine. There's growing concerns about the state of internationalism in the United States. And I always start off by saying, before I start criticizing the administration, that the Biden administration, while it hasn't done enough, has done a lot for Ukraine. And you've seen that in our assistance, and the coalition building is done in support of Ukraine. And today, that commitment, of course, is being questioned as President Biden's request to Congress for some $61 billion of assistance remains stalled in Congress. And what I want to do is provide some context about the stalled assistance package as the situation conjures an image of an America that has gone isolationist and is about to abandon Ukraine. So let me make a couple of points. First, America's internationalism today is actually very robust. I mean, think about, in addition to the assistance that we provided Ukraine, some $70 billion, $78 billion, we have 40,000 US troops deployed in Central and Eastern Europe, over and above the 60,000 we have permanently stationed in Europe. And many of those are deployed to support operations to deter Russia in the context of this conflict. On top of that, we have increasing US military operations in the Asia Pacific to counter Chinese aggression. And more recently, we've deployed 2 carrier groups off of Israel in response to the Israel-Hamas war. This internationalism is reflected in public support to NATO, which I believe is at an unprecedented high. In 2022, at the end of 2022 in September, the Council on Foreign Relations issued a survey, and it found that 81% of Americans believe that we should either sustain or increase our commitment to NATO. 81%. More recent polls show a slight decline to 67, 73%. That's pretty darn high. The support for Finland's accession to NATO was 76%. For Sweden, 76%. But interesting, for Georgia and Ukraine, that support in that poll was 67% and 73% respectively. That's confidence in NATO. And if you're confident in NATO, you're inherently internationalist. Second, in Congress, there continues to be wide and sustained support for Ukraine. And when you look at the chairman and ranking minority members of the key committees, in fact, I would argue all the committees on both sides of the Congress, the House and the Senate, you have 2 views. One, they either support Biden's request and his support for Ukraine, or they criticize him for not doing enough. And again, I would argue that this is buttressed by public support, which has consistently been around 61% in support of economic assistance for Ukraine, 63% for military assistance to Ukraine. And for those who oppose that assistance, I always believe there ought to be a second question in the polls. And would you get up in the morning on Sunday at 8 o'clock in the morning, go to the White House and protest? The answer would be pretty low. So I don't think the opposition you find in polling is actually that strong and operationalized. The third point I would make is regarding the supplemental. The supplemental isn't blocked by a mass in Congress. It's blocked by a small tyranny of a minority. Almost all Democrats support assistance to Ukraine. Many would like more. The same is largely true of Republicans, though there is a larger swath that questions support for Ukraine. But worse, there's a handful, about 8 or 9 House extremists who put a vice grip on the Speaker of the House, who has enormous power over legislation and the flow of legislation. That vice grip is a rule that the House passed last year when it brought in Speaker McCarthy. And in desperation to get the Republicans behind him, including these extremists, he allowed a rule to be established that gives a single member of the House the right to activate a motion to vacate the speakership, a vote to remove the Speaker. That was a sacrifice the Speaker made to secure that support, and it has given them a vice grip on this assistance. And it makes it difficult for the Speaker to even put forward votes on Ukraine assistance. But my sense, and this has been reaffirmed by several conversations with senior leadership in the House and the Senate, is that because of the mass support for Ukraine on Capitol Hill, this is going to work out. It's going to be ugly. It may not be before Christmas, but that assistance package will make it through. And right now, there are negotiations going on, tying that assistance package at $61 billion to efforts to reform the laws or strengthen the laws that would restrict the flow of migrants into the U.S., particularly those flowing across the southern border. It's a deal that can be made. The fundamental math is on the side of Ukraine. So when that $61 billion comes, the question will follow is, what will Biden do with that assistance? Will he contain his current level of support, or will he use it decisively to truly enable Ukraine to win this war on its terms and quickly? And that is a broader issue of strategy. And for that to happen, I'll just end very quickly. There has to be a real shift in the West strategy towards Ukraine. And I would say that consists of 5 elements. One, that is unambiguously and clearly adopting Ukraine's war aims, which is total territorial reconstitution. I can't see any outcome short of that that can be defined as a success. Any outcome short of that would be a reward for revanchism, territorial aggrandizement, use of force to rewrite borders. It would be a recipe for further aggression in the region, and it would help unleash similar dynamics elsewhere around the world. So we have to adopt Ukraine's war aims unambiguously and with determination. Second, of course, something you've all heard and been supporting, which is we have to increase the flow of weapons to Ukraine, the quality of those weapons, and lift the restrictions that have been placed on them against legitimate military targets in Russia. Third, there has to be real economic sanctions against Russia. It breaks my heart. I see these hearts coming up. I assume that's a positive. What happens if I say something you don't like? You send a different.
No chance. Everything you say is taken as the word of God.
I'm worried now. But no, economic sanctions. I mean, look, Russia is last year, its economy grew. This year, there are projections that it could be up to 2%, and the same for next year. We are not body slamming the Russian economy in a way that's really affecting their ability to execute this war. And in fact, we're giving them an opportunity to start reconstituting their capacities to become a more dangerous threat in the years to come. Fourth, we have to more directly engage the Russian people. There's been hesitancy on part of the West to really inform the Russian people about what their government has done and the sacrifices and costs it's imposing on those people. I recognize it's an authoritarian society, it's the structure over there. I recognize you're not going to win through democratic elections to end this war in Russia, but there is a political dimension in Russia that we should be leveraging, and we're not. And then finally, I strongly believe that NATO membership for Ukraine has to be part of both the win strategy for this war and for securing the stability, if not peace, after the war. I really believe extending NATO membership to Ukraine now is the most effective way to communicate to Putin that Ukraine is off the table, is not available for subordination, and is fully integrated in the West. That has to be done now. And of course, it will be the bedrock for ensuring at least some stability after this war, or maximum stability after this war, if not enduring peace. So those are the 5 key elements for a more effective transatlantic strategy to support Ukraine, to enable it to win on its own terms, to win fast, and to deliver a Europe that is more stable and secure, if not at peace. I hope that's useful, Mark.
Well, Ian, you noticed the hearts and the thumbs up that okay, they're still flying.
I really appreciate it. I'm dying to see someone send a negative. I want to see what a negative looks like.
No, we don't have such things. So especially when it comes to someone who has been such a staunch supporter of Ukraine. So let me ask you this question before we move on to discussing the meeting with or the conference with Congressman Turner. All of these views, why aren't they implemented? Why is the Biden administration so cautious, in your opinion? I mean, the fact that you're sharing these, I've seen the letters that you've signed and others, of course. So you're on the right side of history, and I mean the collective thinkers in this field. But then, the administration seems to be, overly cautious from the point of view of many Ukrainians. Well, what's the game here?
They have been overly cautious, but let me emphasize, to be fair, Biden needs to be given praise, deserves praise for the financial support he's provided Ukraine. He deserves praise for the coalition of support internationally he's fostered for Ukraine and has sustained it. That is not an easy task. So I commend him for that. But yes, I agree with you, agree with the assertion that he's been overcautious, and this has inhibited the effectiveness of our support and has not therefore enabled Ukraine to do what it could do, which is to win decisively on the battlefield. And that has been driven by two primary factors. One is the president's personal belief that he has to avoid an escalation of this war that could lead to nuclear war. He's been very clear about that. I personally believe he exaggerates that threat. And when he exaggerates that threat, he's actually emboldening Putin. And by emboldening Putin, that actually creates greater risks of this war escalating both vertically and horizontally. And then second, he's been very cautious about not overburdening the consensus of the alliance and the coalition that he has built. And there, I think he could be more bold, because I think while there are some countries who won't do what I suggested, there are a good number who would if the United States were in the lead. And I think that would provide the critical mass necessary to enable Ukraine to do what it needs to do on the battlefield and to win decisively and, above all, win quickly.
Which leads me to the second question, linked to the passing 3 days ago of one of the two recognized titans of international relations thought and doctrine, obviously, Dr. Henry Kissinger, who, together with your late father, Zbigniew Brzezinski, was really one of the two legends of American foreign policy, both of them born in Europe, both of them remembering both Nazism and the communism. But Kissinger, was viewed as kind of also cautious, a defensive realism in a way. I mean, both of them went to Harvard and studied under similar professors. But your father, within the context of a Democrat administration, was much bolder on the Soviet Union. I mean, he's created with the support for the Mujahideen and for his staunch anti-communist views. Now we're having a Democratic administration which doesn't seem to be applying his precepts. Well, what do you think he would have advised Biden, knowing the Soviet Union, knowing Russia, and how they're really interlinked? Putin being a Soviet trained KGB officer, no illusions here. What do you think your dad would have said?
Well, since he passed away in 5 years ago, 6 years ago, the world has changed. So I'm a little bit hesitant to project what he would do now. I'm not smart enough to carry that kind of.
Based on his views when he was in.
I can say this without ambiguity. He was a staunch defender of Ukrainian independence and Ukrainian sovereignty. When I was a volunteer in Ukraine in 1993 and 94, I had the privilege of working with him and standing up something that he led called the U.S.-Ukraine Action Committee, which brought together top foreign policy, national security leaders from both sides, Ukraine and the United States, financial leaders and political leaders. And it was a really exciting initiative. It involved several conferences in Washington and in Kiev, all geared towards supporting Ukraine consolidating its sovereignty and deepening its integration into the West. And that was fully consistent with his life's work, which was, to study the Soviet system, to figure out where its fractures are, and to leverage those fractures to free Central and Eastern Europe, including the nationalities of what we call now the former Soviet Union, which is, of course, Ukraine. And what he always believed that, I'll share this. One of his biggest shocks in his life, one of the most formative moments in terms of the evolution of his thinking, was the West's response to the Budapest uprising in 1956. Because that uprising in part was not catalyzed is probably too strong a word, but certainly was supported rhetorically in the lead up to it by the West, by talks of rollback, need to, free the Central Europeans, encouraging resistance. And then all of a sudden that resistance movement took place and it was violently suppressed and the West did nothing. My dad was totally disillusioned by that. And so then he tried to figure out what is the best way short of war to unleash the power of the nationalities within the Warsaw Pact, within the Soviet Union, to break up not only the Warsaw Pact, but also the Soviet Union. And that's what much of his writing and his research was geared towards in the 1950s, the 1960s, his time in the White House in the 1970s, and in the 1980s. And Ukraine was an important part of that. And he always emphasized that, the most profound impact on Russia's evolution will be the consolidation of Ukraine's independence and the form in which that independence matures. And for him, the emergence of a Ukraine integrated into the West that is democratic and defined by rule of law was the most effective way to unleash Russia from its centuries of imperialistic history.
Well, and here's the main difference between his views and those of the now late Kissinger, who only this year, as far as I remember, acknowledged that Ukraine should actually be admitted to NATO. Yep. He was known for his staunch opposition against this, obviously overcautiousness, but mixed with some faulty theoretical musings over defensive realism and the importance of Russia. Unfortunately, this had real life repercussions and consequences. One of the paradoxes is that in Ukraine, the current administration, especially the National Security Advisor, is often thought of more as Kissingerian in their approach, that China is more important, that Ukraine is not that, is not in a realist sense of great power diplomacy. The focus should be on China. So it's a paradox that you have a democratic administration with people with Kissingerian thinking when it comes to great power politics. So,
if I could just say, one of the profound impacts or profound significance of Kissinger's shift is that I don't think Kissinger ever shifted from being a realist school of international theory, a realist school for international strategy. He never abandoned that. And for him to make that decision shows how important it is to support Ukraine.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Ian, we have a dozen or more good questions. Before that, would you mind spending a couple of minutes to talk to us about the meeting you had with Congressman Rogers? We spoke about his plan a little bit before we met, but you were in a meeting with him or in a conference a couple of days ago. So
what I was suggesting is that people are interested. Congressman Turner, who has a lot of influence on Capitol, he's chairman of the Intelligence Committee in the House of Representatives, and he has a remarkable series which he calls Beyond the SCIF, CIF, which I believe stands for Special Compartmentalized or Sensitive Compartmentalized Information Facility.
Special, compartmentalized intelligence.
Because they hold all their meetings, or almost all their meetings, in a SCIF.
I know these ones, yeah.
As a result, very few people outside Capitol Hill have an understanding of what this committee does. And it's very significant because they oversee and in many ways, give go-aheads or block very sensitive intelligence operations, from collections to active measures. So what he's created is this initiative or this seminar series called Beyond the SCIF, in which he goes out to the public, pulls together his own set of witnesses, so to speak, and has informal conversations with them on a variety of different issues. And so on Wednesday of this week, I had the honor of being one of those participants, and he moderated an event at the Atlantic Council, Beyond the SCIF, on U.S. policy regarding Ukraine. And it was Chairman Turner throwing questions to four analysts. And I thought it was a really interesting discussion that touched on his views of why Ukraine is important to support, his views on NATO's relationship with Ukraine, and then he was testing his views and drawing perceptions from these four analysts, including myself, on those and other related issues concerning support to Ukraine.
Okay.
Not to promote myself, but I just think it's a real good opportunity to get an in-depth view of a very senior member of Congress's perceptions of Russia's war against Ukraine, and what is at stake for the United States?
Absolutely. And as I mentioned during our preliminary discussion 2 days ago, Chairman Turner, together with Chairman Rogers and the Chairman McFaul, issued a proposed plan for victory in Ukraine, which has just come in my possession last night, actually. So I'm going to discuss this with my students this week. Okay, many good questions. So I'm going to start grouping them and kind of summarizing some of them. One is on this latest Economist article suggesting that Putin seems to be winning the war. So the question is, do you think Europe will, put its act together and develop a grand strategy vis-a-vis Russia? So that's one of them. Another one is on the prioritizing the threats. So would the US be able to prioritize between Israel, Taiwan, Ukraine, should we end up in a situation where we have to support the three of them even more directly? And then there was one on the Budapest memorandum because you were in Kiev around that time.
Yeah,
they asked me if you were aware, if what was the debate then? Why was it such a faulty international instrument? So let's start with those three, and then we'll move from there.
So remind me, the first one is
the lack of strategic vision within Europe, and the fact that the Economist and others are publishing, defeatist or critical articles saying that, well, we should acquiesce, or maybe Putin is winning because the West, in particular Europe, doesn't have a coherent strategy vis-a-vis Russia. So do you think this is going to change? Do you think this vision of Ukraine potentially not winning so quickly would galvanize support within the European capitals? And of course,
well, there is, it is true that there is a growing perception that the war has entered kind of a stalemate. I don't agree with that perception, but I'm also not Pollyannish about the direction of the war. I don't agree with the stalemate because I see the level of costs that Ukraine is imposing on Russian forces. I see the progress it's making on its eastern and southern front, particularly crossing the Dnieper these last weeks. And I fully recognize that while that progress might not be as dramatic as people had hoped, it's nonetheless real and been made against extremely entrenched and deep and wide defenses that the Russians were given time to dig in. And you know it, 10 kilometers wide, unimaginable numbers of mines, countless fortifications, tank traps, fighting positions, and such. And Ukraine is doing that without any air cover, without the full spectrum of long-range strike, and is doing it against an adversary that hasn't felt the real pressure of international support along the lines that I had talked about. The weapons that we need to provide to Ukrainians should be providing them. The economic pressure we should be putting on Russia, the engagement of the Russian people, and the list goes on. So what I'm trying to say is there is this perception. I'm optimistic it can be broken and will eventually be broken because I think people begin to recognize what is at stake. And I'll leave it at that.
Okay, well, fair enough. Then the question is on the second one was on prioritizing between the three potential conflicts. Well, two actually that are ongoing, and then potentially Taiwan. I guess would the U.S. be able to support all those three efforts, especially if something in East Asia gets even more? I mean, there is a conflagration there. There's a conflict, and then a related question: do you think is it hypothetically possible that the U.S., if Taiwan and Israel are so threatened that we would focus really mostly on them and kind of trade Ukraine, to put it, rudely, but to kind of Ukraine, not as supplied with weapons and the support as they should be.
Let me put it in two phrases. One is the room for optimism, and one that's a concern. When it comes to our ability to finance the Ukraine supplemental and to do more for Ukraine in the context of these other challenges that at their current level of burden today, there's no doubt that we can do it. I mean, the United States has a $6 trillion, spends $6 trillion a year in federal monies. 61 billion is a drop in the bucket. So we can handle that. We can handle current levels of operations in the Middle East and in the Indo-Pacific without batting an eye. It's not a financial challenge. It's a challenge of strategy and will. What I am concerned about is that there seems to be a spread of conflagration around the world. It started most obviously in Ukraine and dramatically. And I think the hesitancy of the West, including the United States, including NATO allies, to act decisively against this Russian aggression, combined with some other factors, perhaps including the way the United States withdrew from Afghanistan, it's pulling from Iraq, has created a perception that the West, the United States, and NATO has lost a will to fight. Not that it's looking for fights, but it has to be ready and willing to take on fights when they are necessary. And Ukraine, our response to Ukraine has not been adequate, and I think has contributed to that perception, and therefore I think has contributed to the unleashing of violence in the Middle East, the atrocities committed by Hamas against Israel, the attacks that we're seeing against U.S. forces in Syria and Iran, and the increasing assertiveness we're seeing in China. And I'm not worried about ultimately the ability of the United States and our allies to handle a surge and escalation in these conflicts. We met that challenge in World War I. We met that challenge in World War II. But what I don't want to see is that surge or escalation, because our ability to beat them back is going to require far more financial costs and immeasurable human cost. And we don't want that. We don't have an interest in that. So for me, the 5 factors that I pointed out about why the United States has so much at stake in supporting Ukraine, those same factors complemented with the fact that we don't want these regions to flare up further, makes it even more important, even more imperative for the United States and the West to decisively defeat Russia, beat it out of Ukraine, have Ukraine win on its terms, be totally territorially reconstituted. That is not only the right thing to do for Ukraine, that's not only the right way and most effective way to ensure stability, if not peace, in Europe. It's the most effective way to signal to our adversaries to back off in the Middle East and Indo-Pacific and elsewhere around the world.
Well, let me add to this the comment that was made by our current U.S. ambassador to China, Nicholas Burns, who over a decade ago was my professor at the Kennedy School. He put it very simply and very in a very compelling way. The U.S. is a great power. That means we must be able to walk and shoot at the same time. So any thought that we were only able to handle one conflict and then not be able to take care of other regions.
It's one thing to have the capacity to defeat an adversary. It's another thing to have the will to defeat that adversary. And that's the challenge we're grappling with today.
Well, and I guess this is one of the main
in the United States.
Yeah. This is one of the main criticisms when it comes to the indecisiveness of some of the actions of the administration. Now, when it comes to the Budapest memorandums, there are a couple of questions. Obviously, you were there in Ukraine in 93, 94. Do you have any memories of the debate? I mean, were you part of the debates at the time, or were you asked about some of the preparatory work?
I mean, I was asked. I was there. I was asked. I mean, I don't want to overstate that I was a major contributor to the decisions that Ukraine and the United States and the UK and Russia made on this. But I was there, and I distinctly remember the hesitancy with which Kiev signed that accord. They wanted security. Kiev wanted security guarantees, and the United States was unwilling to provide that. And so they provided assurances. And basically, the West strong-armed Ukraine. We basically said, if you don't sign this accord, if you don't give up those nuclear weapons, you're going to put into question our support to you. So Ukraine was locked between a rock and a hard place. And I think fundamentally, it made the right decision under those circumstances. But it's certainly a decision that I'm sure many have regrets about today.
Yeah, definitely. President Clinton, as you know, shared his regret about that. There were other decision makers. The late Secretary of Defense Ash Carter, also a professor in the past at the Kennedy School. He was then the Assistant Secretary in charge of this process. So many mistakes were made with regard to Ukraine. So logically, our audience, our students, are keenly interested in your insights on that. A good question on another publication, the Washington Post, described how most of the money designated for Ukraine actually stays in the U.S. The money that the Congress votes and authorizes really supports American industries, defense industry, etc. So it's in the interest of those. I mean, presumably, in the interest of those Congress people to have those jobs and to have those funds go to their constituents. Why do you think there's this discrepancy that some of them actually were opposed or are opposed to this process, to this aid?
Look, there are probably some members of Congress, and it's their right, who really question the wisdom of supporting Ukraine. So that's obviously one factor. I think another factor, but I don't think it's a predominant factor. I don't think it's a predominant factor even among the Republican opposition to support to Ukraine. But it's 450 members. There's a wide spectrum of views. Wouldn't doubt. I'm not surprised if there are a couple in there who really question what our interests are in Ukraine. I strongly disagree with them. As for the rest of them, most of them are fundamentally in support of Ukraine. So again, that's why I was trying to communicate. It's not like we have to win a majority. We have to work to convince a majority in the House and Senate to support Ukraine. Those numbers are there. They're not even there. They're overwhelmingly there. We have a tyranny of the minority, and I'm talking about an extreme minority that's gumming up the situation over here. And that's wrapped into some of our national politics with President Trump egging on these extremists to exercise the power that they've been able to wrap around the neck of the speaker. As for the awareness of all the members of Congress about how Ukraine assistance actually flows through their communities, I actually think most of them are aware. And while it's true for us to kind of emphasize this, I'm not sure that case is actually, let me put it this way, that case isn't decisive in terms of knocking this assistance forward, but I think it will help increase the pressure on that extreme minority to rethink their position and to loosen their grip. And it might also encourage the speaker to take more of a risk because it will help him understand that there's a wider set of dynamics that support this assistance package.
Linked to this is the recent, a couple of days ago, Putin announced a huge increase of the Russian budget. How is this? I mean, obviously, it's unmatched since Soviet times. Effectively, a huge increase, increase in the spending for next year, with the vast portions of it spent on the military, on national security in Russia. Have you seen any comments about that in the U.S. and do you think he's gonna whip up the ability or the will of the European nations, many of them who don't spend the necessary 2% for NATO?
There is growing concern in the community of analysts and probably policymakers also that follow this conflict, that Russia is beginning to reconstitute its defense industrial capacity, which means it's going to start actually reconstituting its warfighting capacity. And I look at it in this way. One of the biggest mistakes that we made, perhaps the most profound mistake we made in the last year and a half, is that we allowed Russia to weaponize time. By not giving the Ukrainians the capability to decisively defeat the Russians that are occupying their territory. And the Ukrainians have that capability, they just don't have the means. I mean, they have the people, they have the fighters, they have the tenacity to do it. They just haven't had the offensive capability necessary to execute those ambitions. By sort of bleeding out our assistance to Ukraine, we gave Russians time to dig in. And that's why they have these massive fortifications stretching across occupied Ukraine, and it's made it so hard for the counteroffensive to be more successful. We're giving Russia a second opportunity to weaponize time by not giving the Ukrainians the ability to win decisively, giving them the capability necessary to break through these defenses. We're giving the Russians more time to, gear up their defense industry, start producing more unmanned aerial vehicles and loading munitions, more tanks, more armored personnel carriers, more missiles and such. And we're going to if we're not careful, we're going to wake up a year from now with a Russia that is not only more difficult to defeat in Ukraine, more difficult to break through Russian defenses, but it's going to be a Russia that's going to have an increased offensive capability. And that is very worrisome to me.
And that's a Russia that will then be emboldened to not only try to break the status quo in Ukraine, but also challenge NATO in the Baltics, Poland, of course, where your brother is the ambassador, and then other areas across the global south.
Yeah, Russia that's reconstituting its armed forces is not only more of a threat to Ukraine, it poses a threat of horizontal escalation that could be a direct threat to NATO proper.
I love the way you put it. I mean, you really nailed it. Weaponizing time on the part of Russia and Putin. How about them weaponizing the U.S. election cycle and the assumption or the hypothesis or the view that they're really trying to wait out until Trump potentially comes back to power? How realistic is that? And if in the unlikely or unfortunate occasion this becomes a fact, what should Ukraine and in a broader sense NATO expect from such a return to power?
Well, there's a return of Trump to power. Is that what you're saying?
Is it potentially possible if he does? What should some of the questions of what should the Ukraine expect?
The way I answer that is that, if Trump were to retake the White House, it would have a real damaging effect on the transatlantic relationship and probably have an immediate operational effect on Ukraine's battle against Russia. There's no question about that. Trump will come back to office with a vengeance against Ukraine because he believes falsely that Ukraine was, a source of many of his political problems. When presented with that contingency, it's not a pretty contingency. In some ways, it's a worse contingency than in the last 4 years we had with him, because he will come back to office with the experience of having served in that position before. He'll come back without making the mistake of bringing people into his cabinet who actually oppose his policies. These will be more toadies he brings into office. There will be retribution politically in the United States, and there wouldn't be surprises retribution as part of our foreign policy against those countries he feels that did him wrong. So it's an ugly scenario. But I would point out, I don't think it's a likely scenario. I just don't see, I was wrong in 2016, but I got to point out, when you look at the last several elections, Trump hasn't really done so well. You had the blue wave in the midterm elections of 2018 under his great presidency, and I put that in quotes. So he lost much of Congress in that election. He lost the 2020 elections to Biden, and Biden campaigned on a democracy theme, by the way, and proved to be even more important and a more powerful driver of votes in his favor than I anticipated. In Biden's midterm elections, Trump basically lost opportunities for the Republicans. He barely won the House, got the House with a narrow minority. It should have been a red wave, and he didn't get the Senate. He put a bunch of clowns up for Republican candidates in the Senate, but also in the House. And just recently, earlier this month, we had kind of state and local elections, and so there were significant defeats to Republicans, in large part because of policy they supported that had been supported by Trump, the abortion being one of the most prominent ones. And then, looking forward, he's going to be dogged by the Supreme Court that he put into place that roll back the right of abortion in the United States. That's not going to help him. He's now taking on Obamacare. I don't want to get into the details of American politics here, but rolling back Obamacare was something he was unable to do during his tenure as president, and actually contributed to opposition to him. So that's another counterproductive policy that he's pursuing. He's shown no lessons learned from the mistakes of these past elections. And I would argue that as legal cases against him mature, they're not going to eradicate his support, but they're going to start chiseling at the sides of them. And his base is going to become a little bit more narrow. And the concerns about what he would do to American democracy, I believe, are becoming increased in the United States, and will actually motivate a lot of Republicans to vote against him. Republicans, for example, who wouldn't vote in the election because they don't like Biden, because they don't like Trump, will actually be more inclined to vote for Biden than in the previous election. So I'm actually optimistic he's not going to win.
Okay. How about the chances of, let's say, Nikki Haley to get the nomination? What is your feeling at this point?
I think there's a reasonable chance she should get it. I think we're beginning to see a weakening of Trump's dominance, and you could see Trump winning in Iowa. You could see her doing really well in New Hampshire. You could see other Republican nominees or Republican contenders dropping out, support consolidating behind her winning in South Carolina, and then all of a sudden you got a real race. The problem that Nikki Haley has is a problem that any Republican nominee has other than Trump. If they get the nomination, the likelihood is Trump isn't going to back them. He's not going to stand down. He's going to become an independent, and he'll basically weaken the Republican nominee. And that's a good outcome for Biden.
Okay. All right. Last question, because we need to let it go in a couple of minutes.
Well, let me throw a question, if I could.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
There are voices that come back, but I'd love to hear, the perceptions of your Ukrainian colleagues, your Ukrainian class of the United States. How has their confidence in the United States evolved over the last 2 years? And I'm really eager for a very frank, I think I know what it is, but it's important to hear it from the Ukrainians.
Okay, to do this, however, let me ask our IT guru to allow everyone to turn on to unmute and turn on the cameras, because we have a special format for the talks, but now you're asking them to actually join and say a few words. Or if you want to, written answers will be difficult to handle at this point. Anton, can you help us with unblocking everyone so they can?
They turn on one or two.
Yeah, those who want to answer Ian's question, please turn on the cameras. Let me know, and I'll turn them on on my end here. Who wants to go first? Let me see a show of hands. Okay, so Dmitro, yeah, just a second. Just give me a second, yeah.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Do you hear me well? Thank you for your insights. Thank you for your comments. Really highly appreciate your level of expertise and the experience. And regarding your question, I can only admit that the United States of America had brought here tremendous support to our people, to our nation, towards this full-scale invasion and war. And I could not agree more that we have only the possibility to win. And I think that with the help of the United States, both like financing our country, helping our military, we'll definitely become during the short-term period a member of NATO, and of course, like a fully democratic society, combating our internal issues with corruption. And of course, I think within the short-term period, we're also going to be a member of the European Union. Of course, with the help of the United States of America. So thank you. Hope I'll be back there once again. Previously, I've been to New York and to Washington, D.C. So I'd like to see you once again. Thank you. Thank you, Jan. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dmitro. We have Vadim making a comment in the chat that me personally, I'm thankful for any help, and I couldn't have asked for a better ally. And then we have Andriy and Daria. Go ahead.
Hello everyone. Hello, Jan. Hello, Mark. Do you hear me well?
Yes. Loud and clear.
Perfect. Jan, first of all, thank you very much for your words today and for your optimistic approach, because we are really lack of it, especially the last weeks, the last months, because there are only talks about the negotiations and that we are stuck at the front and there are huge problems with supply, with our support at the West. But my question, it was actually written, and I will try to say it aloud. Do you think that one of the problems that can be that the West world and the already constructed international security and political system is not ready for a new player like Ukraine, and is not ready to get rid of the old one that is maybe awful, maybe quite dominance and rude and with a kind of occupancy behavior, but it's already known. So you know what he is going to do, you know how to react, you know what is actually the border that can't be crossed, etc. So we feel in Ukraine that may be the problem, that we are the new player, and the construction that already exists are not okay with us, but okay with Russia, unfortunately. Thank you very much for your support and for your answer.
Thanks, Andriy. If I understand question, what you're asking, I guess I tried this answer.
It's the devil the problem.
Yeah. When it comes to Ukraine and its relationship and its role in the transatlantic community, I think there's a fundamental eagerness to see Ukraine be fully integrated. And by that, I mean in NATO and the EU. The problem is that on NATO, there is a real fear that it'll draw the West into a war with Russia that the West doesn't want. And that's where the risk of escalation becomes such an impeding factor in U.S. and West European policy. Regarding the EU, I think there's a fundamental desire to see Ukraine fully integrated. But I was just in a dinner last night where people were going, well, what's going to happen to our agricultural economy? How much of a burden will there be financially? Because with EU membership will come an additional member in the union that can draw on its assistance funds, and it can be quite costly. So there's some hesitance factors that don't override that desire for Ukraine's full integration, but that are certainly complicating it. It's not a clear answer, but to me it kind of reflects the idealism and then sometimes the fear of the costs that come with the pursuit of one's idealistic objectives. And by idealistic, I don't mean unattainable. I mean things that we're looking for. And as for Russia, again, it comes down to, let me put it this way: the West was burdened over the last 3 decades by a naive assumption that Russia would immediately transform into a democracy. It would shed its imperialist ambitions and would become a genuine partner of the West in dealing with, global challenges. And I was even in an administration that reflected that. Was, Bush 43, and he looked into Putin's eyes, and, he saw a man he could work with, and our naive outreach to work with Russia on counterterrorism operations. The good news is I think that naivete has been largely washed from our strategic perspective, and you see that even in the biggest proponents of that naive approach, the Germans, bringing a more realistic understanding of what Russia is today and the threats that it poses.
Okay, Ian, we have 2 hands that I see, Dari and Norek. Are you okay with taking those 2 questions and comments?
Sure.
Yeah, Dari, please, very short, maximum 1 or 2 minutes, no longer statements, just Dari, just straight.
I'm going to be short. Thank you, Ian, for your talk. You asked us to give us our comments on how we view the United States right now. And I just want to mention that, as you said, that the US are not willing to fight right now. And from my perspective, although beggars can be choosers, but still it feels that the United States are kind of following the lead. They're trying not to cross the red lines that have been crossed so many times. And it seems that they're kind of being manipulated by Russia and by Putin. So that, I think that was short. So that's my overview on the United States policy and politics right now.
Great, much appreciated. Much appreciated.
All right, Oleg, you got the last question. Very, very short, very concise. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for the possibility. Dear Jan, there is the main question for me. Excuse me, please. I want to honor the memory of Jimmy Carter, and I'm very wondering if this did you have a chance to meet with this legendary president of the United States, and could you mention any kind of inspirational things that you may tell about Jimmy Carter because of your father and because of your life, that probably you are well connected? Thank you very much. Excuse me for such probably personal question.
My impression of President Carter?
Yeah, have you met him? What was your impression? What was his impact on you?
No, his profound impact. I mean, by giving my father the responsibilities that he had as National Security Advisor to President Carter, I guess that's how I got inspired to enter a world of public policy and national security. As I don't want to exaggerate my engagements with President Carter. I was very, very young, but I did have the privilege of meeting him, going to the White House once or twice to watch movies with the Carter family and my parents, my brother and my sister. I interviewed him for a series I did on presidential views of U.S. then Soviet symmetry, and he struck me as a man really defined by a high sense of morality, and that drove his policies. Certainly in foreign policy, he's the one that largely introduced human rights as a pillar of U.S. foreign policy, and that has largely been the case in U.S. foreign policy ever since. He was a person who was one of the hardest working presidents. Some people criticized him for that because he would get so into the details. Certainly, when it comes down to owning foreign policy, and I'm very proud of what my father did, And sometimes people will say it was, Brzezinski's foreign policy, or Brzezinski's foreign policy, the second half of the administration. No, 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 no. It was always President Carter's foreign policy. He had a very firm grip and was actively involved in all the major strategic issues. He drove American foreign policy. He listened to his advisors, but he owned it. Some people criticize him for getting, again, too much into the details. But when I look back at the foreign policies of U.S. presidents, those who had greatest ownership of it, personal engagement, giving direct direction and oversight to the cabinet, it would be Joe Biden, it would be Bush 41, and it would be Jimmy Carter. And you can argue the pros and cons of that kind of control, but that's one thing that I always think of about President Carter when I compare him and his policies to those of other U.S. presidents. And then he's a super, super nice guy, very warm, very religious, of course, a true believer in constantly giving back to the community. So, as former president, he just didn't go back and sit down planes and kick his feet up on the porch stairs and call it a day and regale himself with people who come and admire him. He has been the most activist post-president president that we've had. He's created his Carter Center just isn't a library. It's an institution that's gone out and changed the world. Everything from building homes for the needy and the homeless, with the president himself and Rosalynn Carter hammering nails away, to eradicating a type of disease literally eradicating a disease in Africa. I mean, that's real activism. And then I got to say, he was fundamentally a politician, a person who loved the public eye. And I'll give a personal, I'm going on too long, but when my father died, I reached out to him and asked him if he would give a eulogy for my father. And first of all, there he is in his 90s. And it was like talking to a 50-year-old on the phone. He had so much energy. And he agreed to do it. And so when he came to the church and I got to meet him, I have to admit, I was struck by, him being in his 90s. He looked like someone who was in his 90s. It was a little bit more frail than most people. But when he got up to walk up to the dais, up the steps on the podium, to address the crowd, it was like a metamorphosis of this guy. He all of a sudden started sitting up, looking straighter. You could see the energy kind of pulsating through his body. And then he gave, just off the top of his head, this incredibly generous, funny, but substantive eulogy in honor of my dad. And you could see the inner politician of him being unleashed in that church in front of all the people who'd gathered to say final farewell to my father. For me, it was an amazing thing to see. And I said, wow, in that cloak of morality and sound public policy, there was this political animal in him that I think was really, really impressive.
Well, Ian, what a wonderful way to end this discussion with the human dimension of politics. And thank you so much for your candor, for your openness, for your willingness to engage with our students. As I said, you're one of the Ukraine could not have asked for a better friend and supporter than you. You're always welcome to join us. I hope you're able to come to Kiev next year. So we'll host you in the real.
Bring me back. I'll come running.
All right. Thank you, my friend. Thank you for this great discussion. Look how many hearts and thumbs are flying up. So this is a clear sign that everybody loved it. Thank you once again.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.